So let's say that the seller signed a listing agreement for X%, and out of that listing agreement, when the listing agent or broker working with that seller put a number less than the buyer broker's Y%, what happens?
Sure. That's a great question. That happens all the time. Sometimes this number is higher than what's being offered as compensation. So under the buyer-broker agreement, the buyer would be responsible for the differential. They would be responsible for any commission that's not offset by the offer of compensation by the listing broker. So there's a number of things that the buyer could do. They could pay it at that point. So they could pay it directly to the buyer's brokerage. The buyer's brokerage, under the authorization of the principal broker, could decide to lower their commission so that it is completely offset by the listing broker. The buyer could ask the seller in the purchase contract, hey, would you pay that differential? And that's the buyer negotiating with the seller. And if the seller says, yeah, I'm willing to make that concession, so to speak, great. That's negotiated. So I guess the clear point, again, kind of hammers the point home is that all of these commissions, no matter where it's negotiated, is in fact negotiated. It's something that's open to negotiation between the respective parties.
And each one of these parties all have a say in that negotiation, correct?
Yeah. No one's forced to enter into any agreement that they don't feel comfortable with. So it's completely transparent. It's not hidden on page 3 or page 4 of the documentation. It is on the very first page, second section, right below the term of the agency agreement. So it is
perfect
at the forefront.
So is it a violation of an agent's ethical responsibilities if they go onto the MLS and see compensation being offered less than Y and choose not to show that listing to their client?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I'll say it depends. And here's why I say it depends. If it's under the authorization of their client saying, hey, I don't want to have to be on the hook because I want the listing broker to satisfy or offset my obligation entirely, so only show me the properties that do that, that would be fulfilling your fiduciary duty to your buyer. Now, if the agent's doing that under their own volition and violating their fiduciary duty of loyalty, then yeah, that would be a violation. So it kind of depends on the instructions of the buyer.
Perfect. And I would say as a good standard of practice then is typically that conversation may or may not happen of a buyer even knowing to say, I don't want to see houses that the compensation isn't offered. So a best practice as a realtor would be to show every single property that is on the market that matches a client's needs to that client, and then transparently tell them that these properties don't meet our compensation agreement. And so we're going to have the options as you previously prescribed to say, can we put it in to have the seller pay it? Or would you buyer be willing to pay the difference? But you absolutely have a fiduciary responsibility to show the client all of the properties that are in the interest of what they've stated for their parameters. And it's just a best practice to always do that, to lead with information that helps our clients out.
Exactly, and that's, again, the whole transparency aspect. When you're looking at properties with your client, in this case the buyer, you want them to have as much information as possible. They absolutely need to know what is their responsibility because you've highlighted that to them at the forefront. The beauty of the MLS is that it is public facing what is being offered by the listing brokers to the buyer's brokerage. So in addition to you telling them, hey, what's being offered by the listing brokers, they can verify that on their own on every single listing on the MLS. They can see what's being offered by the listing brokerage to a cooperating broker on the MLS.
Could we go through one more conversation about this? Because I think it's important. What happens when a buyer comes directly to a listing broker? One of these 4 parties is not involved in the transaction or being compensated. So in other words, a buyer goes to a listing broker, says, I don't have a buyer broker, therefore give me the buyer broker compensation off the sales price. how is a listing broker to respond to that conversation with a buyer that's unrepresented by a buyer broker?
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. So instead of 4 contracts involved in that real estate purchase, there's only 3. So you eliminate entirely this contract. So there's no representation. The buyer feels comfortable. They just want to go ahead and negotiate with the seller directly, but they do see what's being offered on the MLS, so they think, hey, maybe I can get that discount on my overall purchase. The key component is knowing that what the seller and the listing broker have agreed to, that's their contract. And so whether the buyer is represented or not, the seller has already agreed to, in this case, that X% of commission. That is something that the listing broker has earned when they sell the property for the seller. And so if an unrepresented buyer comes and the seller accepts an offer from that buyer, there's no obligation unless that's something negotiated between the seller and the listing broker in order to modify. But an outside buyer dictating to the seller and the listing brokerage a change in the listing agreement, the buyer's not a party to that contract. You can kind of see the lines of where the buyer and the seller are connected, and certainly the seller will see that maybe the offer price is lower, but that's going to be up to the seller if they feel comfortable moving forward with that.